Modern society exists in a state of contradiction, awash in both blinding change and defeating repetition. The changes are so frequent, fast, and noticeable that they obscure the repetition, enabling individuals to see everything as new. But to overlook the obscured is to neglect the totality of one's own relationships to the world and others. Marx and Engels knew this all too well, describing the state of affairs in an appraisal of the bourgeois epoch in the quote you see before you on the screen. All that is solid melts into air. Nothing feels like now. No one can keep up. As such, anxieties around change abound while one feels a lack of control, a diminishing of agency. Modern selves know too much, increasingly so during this digital age, but only make sense of it looking backwards. This is, for the most part, a particularly human state of awareness, given that humans have it in them to devote attention to such matters, ones that tend to rest beyond the cause and effect existence of other animals. As Marshall McLuhan observes in War and Peace in the Global Village, quote, "One thing about which fish know exactly nothing is water, since they have no anti-environment which would enable them to perceive the element they live in," end quote. In McLuhan's worldview, humans are able to initiate such anti-environments across various mediums of technologies or media. Change occurs in this type of technology/medium earlier than it does in the content, which always resides in a different previous medium, because the only way to observe said content is when it is recontextualized in contradistinction to a new media. Framed within the terminology of McLuhan's fish reference, this sort of observation of content and medium, itself a part of discourse, which is to be referred to here as critical media literacy, is performed thanks to the emergence of a new environment or anti-environment made possible by a new medium that can make human users of media aware of its content like never before, much like if a fish were to be immediately conscious of water. New media allows individuals to engage in critical media literacy, riddled with anxiety as it might be, because it allows users to translate and grasp the change by looking at things past as opposed to trying to stay ahead of what we cannot. It might sound disorienting, but it is the terrain contemporary individuals must map if they are to be critically media literate. It is a fundamental part of McLuhan's constellation of theories of media, and as such, it embodies this attempt to superimpose that cluster of ideas onto digital media to navigate the Googleburg Galaxy. As kitschy as the term Googleburg Galaxy might seem, the stakes are high for critical mediacy with a McLuhan-esque infrastructure because it is about power. For McLuhan, quote, "All media are active metaphors in their power to translate new experience into new forms. The spoken word was the first technology by which man was able to let go of his environment in order to grasp it in a new way," end quote. Though the influence each medium has upon greater civilization varies, the advent of the printing press has a similar impact and scale as the spoken word for McLuhan, as detailed in his seminal book, The Guttenberg Galaxy. So does the electric age, which brought audiovisual forms of translation with it. Digital media, as a technology, represents such a change as well. These changes are tantamount to paradigm shifts, taking the contemporary self, the fish, and placing it out of water, as it were, and into yet another environment that sublimates solids into air. Unprecedented rates of production of both new technology and its obsolescence in the digital age means that people are able to perceive the sorts of changes the digital media landscape presents to us, but it is not direct, it cannot be static, and it must always be facing backwards, like Walter Benjamin's Angel of History. Applying several of the tenets of the McLuhan-Guttenberg Galaxy to digital media is required for critical media literacy, because the change brought about by digital media, specifically social media, possesses this translational power. Apart from the parallels in verbal taxonomy with McLuhan's term, Guttenberg Galaxy, using Google in this new term merely stands as an embodiment for greater networks of socio-technological relations in the same way that the proliferation of Gutenberg's printing press does not amount to an adequate description of all that its phenomena entails as well. In other words, McLuhan's account of Gutenberg's influence is not solely an account of Gutenberg's direct influence, but rather an access point to analyze things indicative of its specific era. In the same fashion, an exploration of the Googleburg Galaxy takes on a wider evaluative scope than the eponymous one. This task of mapping and constantly maintaining and remaintaining orientation is not a foregone conclusion. For one, there are societal structures, industries of culture, and behavioral patterns that effectively empty media's content of meaning. This will be explored below. Secondly, the aforementioned anxiety is even something McLuhan acknowledges in the form of users' disorientation towards constantly transmogrifying media technologies. Attempting discourse from this position can often invoke anxiety as, quote, "the result of trying to do today's job with yesterday's tools," end quote. While it might not be wholly positive yet to look back on social media content in the way McLuhan means proper, some discourse about a case study in social media's virality, one that has largely ran its course, can serve as a starting point and a trail to circle back to throughout the process to follow.
First, some context, some articulation of this key constellation of modes in the Googleburg Galaxy, social media. Some context involving mapping social media with critical media literacy to highlight both social media's immense hold on culture and the emptiness with which it maintains that hold. Ecologies, including media ecologies, to evoke another of McLuhan's term, have collective lives of their own that are not static, so critical media literacy and its pedagogies exist accordingly. Still, despite the relative youth of social media technologies and the dynamic understanding required to stay educated about them, critical media theory can, in principle, enable access and/or opportunity to an extent similar to traditional literacy. Given the seemingly unstoppable power of social media has been gathering over recent years, one can see this appraisal of critical media literacy as exaggeratory at one's own peril. Critical media literacy seeks to explore questions about power and social justice through understanding media and how new technologies create media that produce text, stories, and images, often without properly explaining them to the user. Therefore, the user requires some basic understanding of how those texts are created, for whom they are created, and how the texts themselves have gotten taken up by audiences and influenced society, often reproducing hegemonic ideologies. This also necessitates inquiry into the ever-changing forms and structure of media and the ways in which human interactions with those media profoundly impact social relations. Discourse of this nature amounts to an awareness of how understandings of the discourse itself gets problematized, altered, and even spurred forward by social networking, digital technologies, virtual spaces, and online personalization. As a form of media that is once ubiquitous and avoidably politically charged, social media, and more specifically, social networking sites like Facebook and Instagram or Twitter, have become more than just popular culture technologies. They've also become contested domains of advertising, recruitment, surveillance, propaganda, and activism. Youth climate activist Greta Thunberg had a virtual presence with her online voice, reaching over 4 million Twitter followers at the time of this paper. In comparison, counter-narratives on Twitter from American President Donald Trump resonate digitally to a following of more than 86 million. Yet both Greta and President Trump lack considerably behind social media czars like 2019's most popular Instagrammers, footballer Cristiano Ronaldo, actress Selena Gomez, and singer Ariana Grande, each with almost 200 million followers or more. With the popular and political competing for global electronic attention, what is often overlooked are questions surrounding access and participation on social media platforms. Who has access and who is denied participation in virtual spaces of popular culture when the popular overlaps with the political? Critical media literacy, being a reader, and having the ability to read continue to hold significant importance, even as traditional forms of text and the definition of what it means to be literate continue to change. In the Guttenberg Galaxy, McLuhan argues that the printing press created a paradigm shift in removing the mystique and aura from texts, most notably religious texts, and making ideas accessible at a more reasonable cost to more people. Not only did the literacy rates rise with the introduction of the printing press, but for McLuhan, social relations and power dynamics were fundamentally and irrevocably changed. McLuhan's argument fits into the larger historical discourse of technological changes referred to as a paradigm shift argument, which for historians of science suggests that technological innovation can fundamentally change and alter the course of human history through this ideological paradigm shift. The history of humanity argues that power and social relations can be fundamentally altered with the existence or the emergence of new technologies. With new practices comes a new understanding of how the world works, which results in changing social roles, changes in human understandings of those roles, and therefore changed power relations in society. Critical media literacy explores how new forms of language and social patterns of interactions on social media, liking, friending, following, or trending, have created a similarly potent paradigm shift, which is changing what it means to exist, both online and in person. Critical media literacy involves active engagement with the text in a way that employs a user's power to construct meaning that is not wholly reliant upon the intended or surface message. When activated, critical media literacy pushes individuals to think beyond their personal engagement with a text, and in pushing past that, to ask questions about power and how systems and ideologies actively shape our personal perceptions of individual actions. User involvement in the production of meaning helps fulfill an individual's civic duty as a member of a participatory democracy, but when applied to social media and its locales of power, a committed understanding can be evasive. and thus participation is thwarted and democracy weakened. Revolving around ephemeral modes such as popularity and trends, manipulated images and video, and even a limited shelf life for some methods of posting content, social media is, by its nature, transitory. Without proper attention via critical media literacy, what should be legitimately influential social media content ends up instead being co-opted into a fad, like the humanitarian cause against Joseph Kony and his Lord's Resistance Army.
So in the name of literacy, let's frame this with pedagogy in mind, applying critical media theory to what might have been a user's experience of what became known on social media as Kony 2012. It can be assumed that there was a degree of anticipation for some users for April 20th of that year, a day of action proposed by the makers of a viral YouTube video of that same name, Kony 2012. Released on March 5th of that year by a not-for-profit organization named Invisible Children, the video sought to expose the actions of Lord Resistance Army leader Joseph Kony in the hopes of having him found and arrested for violations of human rights in Uganda. Kony's LRA was originally a guerrilla group whose purpose was to combat government oppression in the name of citizens. However, Kony fell stereotypically prone to the trappings of religious ethics, narcissism, and the power they hold. As of present day, Kony is, quote, accused of brutalizing civilians in northern Uganda through murder, abduction, mutilation, and the burning of property, end quote, yet still living and hiding from authorities. The video also demonstrates the democratic potential of technologies of social media sites like Facebook and Twitter to raise global awareness of a local issue by turning an event that would be foreign to casual users into an object to be uploaded, downloaded, shared, liked, tweeted, emailed, and discussed. Indeed, Kony 2012 went viral. In light of new technologies and increasing globalization, messages can spread and/or go viral in less than a minute. Consider that in the eponymous year of Kony 2012, social media was well on its way to ubiquity. In the spring of that year, according to Rogers Communications, which is the largest telecommunications company in Canada, every 60 seconds there were more than 695,000 status updates on Facebook, more than 98,000 tweets, more than 66,000 photos uploaded to Flickr, and more than 600 new videos uploaded to YouTube. The potential for voices and proliferation of critical media literacy was considerable, and Invisible Children pegged April 20th for an event called Cover the Night to make use of this power and further expose Kony's legacy of savagery in order to pressure international authorities to locate, apprehend, and charge the divisive leader for his atrocities. Supporters were meant to perform local charity work in their community for the morning of April 20th, followed by an evening of posting flyers and posters in their neighborhood, culminating in an online meetup. Already by the end of March that year, barely a month after the video's release, Kony 2012 had more than 86 million views on YouTube. So an event of consequence was widely anticipated. As a former professor in children's studies whose work explored children's rights and issues such as child soldiers, one of these very authors received more than 300 emails from former students within a 48-hour span when Kony 2012 first went viral. And yet, when logging onto social media on 4/20/2012, Kony 2012 was virtually nowhere to be found. It was not trending on Twitter, nor was it proliferating through status updates on Facebook. Instead, what was trending on Twitter that morning and continually throughout the day were relatively vapid tweets about April 20th or 420, a number that is largely connected to marijuana use in popular culture. Social media's potential for positive grassroots social change via new technology had disappointed, proving Kony 2012 to be nothing more than empty activism, and this failure goes beyond the explanation of 420 trending annually. Over 50,000 people signed up for online for the event or bought flyer and poster kits. But the global participation was exemplified in places like Vancouver, where, quote, about 17, end quote, demonstrators met downtown at a location disclosed by a Facebook event which 21,000 users had said they would attend. Kony 2012, much like Joseph Kony himself, had become invisible to a public who hunted him, disappearing into the ether as all that is solid melts into air. What's worse, social media's waning effectiveness here eventually superimposed itself upon the actual state of affairs, much in the way that content catches up to media for McLuhan, not only muting the search for Kony, but also allowing Kony himself to be swallowed up by the same systems and environments he had once antagonized. On July 8th, 2005, the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for Kony's arrest, one which has proven to be impotent since. Over the ensuing years, the LRA moved from Uganda through South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, eventually ending up in the dense jungles of the Central African Republic. Though shrinking in numbers, the army remained enough of a threat to resurface in the global news cycle again in 2011, when Invisible Children motivated then US President Barack Obama to send 100 soldiers to the Central African Republic to help locate and defeat Kony. 6 years later, some 2,000 total US and Ugandan soldiers sent to the area ended their mission with this report from US Army spokesperson Lieutenant Colonel Armando Hernandez, quote, "The US sees him as irrelevant, no longer a threat. When you look at the LRA's effectiveness, it's no longer what it used to be," end quote. This decision echoes the lack of commitment across time exhibited by social media users since Cody and his soldiers still loot and abduct from nearby villages. But it also neglects any, let alone adequate, justice for all involved. Healthy but almost 60 years old, Kony and his army have been the victims of mass defections to the extent that the once significant LRA now in 2020 consists of, quote, "just several dozen people, including Kony's sons Salim and Ali. The group's main activities consist of subsistence farming and sometimes selling honey at local markets," end quote. Social media's power to subsume and co-opt voices is so strong, it can hegemonize both activists and war criminals with the same indifference, rendering either of them into spent-up reaffirmations of what is currently en vogue. All of that then to be washed away by new hashtags. This example shows the positives and negatives of social media activism. Kony 2012 demonstrates the potential of social media as a resource for positive social change at the same time as it exposes the challenges in getting people to see the importance of social media messages while they are over-inundated with media and oversaturated with its endless content. Fast forward to 2020, when movements such as hashtag #MeToo and Black Lives Matter have continued to demonstrate how technological spaces for resistance and activism rest inside of a Gordian knot of power and privilege, medium and message, whereby the ability to act or be acted upon, a critical tension within responsible democratic citizenship, can be decided by critical media literacy.
A reminder of the stakes involved with critical media literacy is worthwhile here, which means exposing power. Literacy itself has a historical connection to power, if not constituted of it. McLuhan's argument for the impact of the printing press as a transformative technology in the Guttenberg Galaxy only further emphasizes this point. On an explicit level, it is simple. Those who have the ability to read the laws have historically also been the people to write them. On an implicit level, a person cannot exercise their democratic rights if they are denied access. Literacy is access because reading has historically been a roadblock or access provider for democratic participation. Something as simple and vital to democracy as voting is predicated on the ability of the individual citizen to be able to read the names on the ballot, and for many democratic societies, unjustly, literacy tests were used for decades as a tool for disenfranchisement by acting as a barrier to deny marginalized groups the opportunity to exercise their right as a citizen to vote. In America, for example, literacy tests remained as a barrier for disenfranchisement to the African American community, especially in southern states, a full century after the conclusion of the American Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. This obstacle was only removed in August of 1965, when then President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act. In many ways, reading and literacy have served as an ideological head tax in the West for the last 3 centuries. Literacy's historical connection to power can also be seen through what Paulo Freire deems the naming of the word and the naming of the world. In Freire's groundbreaking text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, one of the greatest struggles for marginalized groups to overcome in their quest for equal status as participatory citizens is the ability to participate in the creation of language, what Freire calls the naming of the world, something that has been denied to them through their oppression. Throughout modern history, the ability to read and write, to share and participate in language is fundamentally about community, dividing inclusion from exclusion. Whether it be Benedict Anderson's notion of the imagined community for Creole people, diasporas, or McLuhan's typographic man who required the printing press in order to have access to the knowledge previously withheld from the everyday individual, language, literacy, community, and power are inextricably linked. For contemporary purposes, one need only look at the present moment to witness the confluence of power, privilege, race, and literacy. The imminent collision of the 2020 US presidential election and raw civil rights movement lay bare the urgency in critical media literacy as made evident by movements such as More Than a Vote, which was started by star athlete LeBron James and other prominent Black athletes and entertainers in order to activate the critical media literacy about the role and responsibilities of all who fight for social justice and equity as democratic citizens. So in the Googleburg Galaxy, critical media literacy provides a vantage point from which to aptly observe and analyze relationships of power, which relationships thrive, which will wither away under competitive pressure, or which ones get assimilated by dominant technologies such as social media, and it's always melting into thin air terms of existence. In many cases like Coney 2012, the intersectionality of media, power, user, and content renders typical explanations that Coney was left to reap the rewards of public fickleness, or that some form of poetic justice was meted out by legal ramifications of exposure unsatisfactory. Rather, it is as though the system co-opted content in what manifests as a twisted irony. On the surface, the Coney 2012 example does not appear to be different from any fad unrelated to social media, a common criticism of social media analysis. As mentioned above, for McLuhan, content takes time to catch up to technologies, so this is not surprising. What is surprising, however, and specific to social media is the sheer speed and volume of users on social media, thus amplifying an impact that is already seismic, and that last term somehow putting it mildly still. Which begs the question, is anything unrelated to social media anymore? It is almost impossible to escape the medium. So how does this mean it is equally impossible to escape the message, since the messages can so easily be ignored or left behind? When all that is solid melts to air, time's relativity distorts. Pair that with humanity's immense ability to adapt, and it's all too easy to forget that as recently as 2007, there were no smartphones at all. Now more popular among younger demographics than its parent company, Facebook, Instagram has not yet existed for a decade. And while these technologies increasingly take hold of our attention and the time of almost everyone on the earth, it would behoove individuals to learn how to read the spaces better. Otherwise, without critical media literacy, the modern democratic citizen is disadvantaging themselves in a manner eerily similar to subjects of the pre-industrial age, trying to learn the ways of their ruling states without anything to read at all. Thank you.